Well, good afternoon for those of you in London, and I think it's just barely good morning in Sarasota, Florida, where we have Jason Voss dialing in, and I think that's absolutely wonderful. This is one of the little silver linings of the pandemic is our ability to get quality speakers from all over the world to come without charging us for first-class flights. That's right, Jason, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Now today is a very interesting session, deception and truth analysis for investors. There is 86.5% of alpha begging to be mined right there in those reports, briefings, and transcripts on your desk. Now, you know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars, which I can only do thanks to the generosity and bluntly the tolerance of our sponsors, who allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And today, I think is particularly interesting because what Jason is pointing out to us, which we all know, is that the vast majority of information is non-numerical. It's buried away in reports, news, emails from people to people. And it's this ability to handle unstructured information that I find very exciting. We talk constantly about people being able to use AI and all sorts of advanced techniques, but there's information sitting right under our nose. Now, my job, of course, is to get out of the way because my musings are not that important and to let Jason talk to you. And if I could, I'm going to make 3 points. One is my introduction should already be over according to the agenda. The second point is very much that we do have the slides posted, and Jason has some very interesting slides in the appendix. Secondly, that yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will go up in approximately 48 working hours, i.e. Wednesday afternoon London time. But most importantly, please use the GoToWebinar question and answer facility. So put your questions in there. I'll introduce them into the 20 minutes that we've got for Q&A with Jason. Please don't email me. Please don't WhatsApp me, Signal me, any of these things, because I'm here with you. So please use that Q&A facility. And that Q&A facility, we will be sending all of those questions with your email to Jason. So if it's a point of detail or you just want to contact him, just stick it in there and we'll all get to him. Now, there's a small, tiny point of information today. Jason is going to do close-up magic. He's going to do a live demonstration. He's going to be asking you to email him some documents. So give some thought to that. And when the time comes, I'm extremely impressed when one of our presenters says, I'm going to do a live demo. That and children and dogs are all things I try and stay away from. Although to be fair, last Wednesday I did ride a charger around the city of London with 7 light cavalry. So who am I to complain? Jason, the floor is yours.
Michael, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you to Zien. Thanks to the FS Club. Thanks to your sponsors. To Peter, on my side, Alex Eagle and Nandan Shah. Thanks for everything. Peter, please advance to the next slide. Okay, so Michael alluded to the fact that I'm going to be doing live magic. We're going to be scoring documents for deception. There are some caveats which I need to share with you. There's my email address. First of all, email there. When we hit Q&A, I'll then begin scoring some of these documents. These are the caveats. They need to be mostly text-based. We don't evaluate numbers at all. That will skew your results. So that's the first thing. Second thing, samples of 750 words or greater. If you don't know what that means, that's about 2 to 3 pages at least. It's hard to evaluate deception on a single word, for example. The more words, the better the sample. And then third, only submit for evaluation statements that you want evaluated. Example of what not to do. If you want an earnings call transcript evaluated, chances are you don't want the operator remarks evaluated for their level of deception or the sell side community's questions. You want management evaluated. Frequently, when we put this kind of a demonstration in front of you, you will submit a document with all of those statements, and we're evaluating the overall deceptiveness of the whole thing. With those caveats, hit that next slide, please. Okay, so why is this important? The first thing, as Michael alluded to, is 86.5% of data is locked up in texts, not numbers. Most of our techniques, our formal training is all in the numbers. And yet our decisions are driven by information. I was a portfolio manager of a mutual fund here in the States for a long time. Within a week or so of doing my work, I realized that the statements issued forth from management I was extraordinarily reliant upon, and I couldn't escape it, right? They're prospective statements about the future. Investing is a future-based activity, and here I was stuck, unequipped with technique. I had exited graduate business school with no such technique. I asked my portfolio manager, I was a research analyst, what do I do? He said, trust your gut. Yeah, it's not very reliable. If you have studied something, likely it's one of the things I'm going to try and debunk and steer you away from in just a second. But we have to trust that information is accurate, but we are ill-equipped to be able to uncover whether or not somebody is deceiving us. Next slide. So overview, you can actually go right past this. I can speak to it. It's not what you think. There are two techniques I'm going to share with you that do work. The first one is strategic use of evidence. The second is deception truth analysis. So what do I mean by it's not what you think? Most people, when asked pan-culturally, what is it that you rely upon in order to evaluate the level of deceptiveness, will say trust your gut. If they have received some form of formal training, it's usually body language based cues, or maybe they say they listen for certain vocal intonations. Folks, this has been absolutely strenuously tested dating back to 1958 and hundreds of times. There's been no consistent, reliable link between body language or things like vocal intonation and deception. Those who have found those results, other researchers, when trying to replicate that work, cannot replicate it. Said another way, the results have been the result of statistical anomaly. That said, the deception science space, of which I'm a deception scientist, we've researched a lot of the cultural fictions that are there, and it is pan-cultural. People in Asia, Europe, Australia, South America, Africa, North America, we all tend to think body language is how you tell. There was a meta-analysis, that's a study of studies that was done, I can't remember the date of this, I think it was the early 2000s. The N is 14,500, and the overall accuracy of deception analysis accuracy is 54% globally. That's basically just slightly better than flipping a coin. Please don't rely on techniques. I'm going to show you two that do work. Financial pros. I did history's very first research along with criminal justice professionals of our industry's ability to surface deception by any means necessary, and we are just 49.4% accurate, so we're even worse than the general public is at this. Within domain, within finance itself, which we also tested, we are just 51.8% accurate at surfacing deception in known deceptive statements done double blind. And worse, that accuracy, 51.8%, comes because we have a very strong truth bias. Said another way, when asked, can you trust the veracity of this? Do you think it's true or false? What was just said, we tend to over bias towards truth. So we're 60.6% accurate on the truth because we guess truth way more. Said another way, we're gullible, and we trust that people in business and finance are telling us the truth. It's not true. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about, go ahead, advance. Strategic use of evidence. So this was pioneered by my research partner when I did research at CFA Institute into deception by Dr. Maria Hartwig as a part of her thesis. And this is dating back, I think, 15, 16 years ago. It is now gaining wider acceptance globally. She actually consults to folks like the Israeli Mossad. I believe she's consulted MI6 there in the UK. Here in the US, the FBI, which is our equivalent of MI5. And Maria has been a steadfast champion of this, and it is history's most successful deception detection technique. It has logged a success rate of 88%. Next slide, please. So what is it, and how does it contrast to the typical way you may have learned how to do this? If you have studied interrogation techniques, especially interrogation techniques designed to elicit deception, most likely you were taught something like this. There are some assumptions. I am going to ask of the audience or of the other person a direct question, the person I'm interviewing, say management or investor relations person at a company. I'm going to ask them a direct question, and I hope that my direct, forthright, very deliberate question triggers some level of anxiety. That anxiety is then supposed to leak out some sort of behavioral indicator, which I'm going to be watching, right? Usually face-oriented, could be hands. Notice I'm gesticulating quite a bit. That's another possible thing that people are trained to look for. The other assumption is that liars somehow feel guilty and anxious. Interestingly enough, research I just read several weeks ago shows that by the time we tell the same lie 3 times, we basically don't feel anxious or guilty about it. Not only that, but most people, not most people, some people, sociopaths, don't feel guilty or anxious about their deceiving at all. In fact, it's so de rigueur to how they go about their lives, they don't feel any anxiety. So the assumption could be called a failure. Assumption 3, some body language is indicative of anxiety. And by reading that anxiety, we can discern whether or not somebody's deceiving us. Assumption 4, that body language cues are more obvious if that person is anxious. So step 1 in this traditional technique is ask direct questions, get them nervous, then watch for the body language. One huge problem with this, besides the fact that it doesn't work, is you've given away your best evidence. You've literally delivered up front the very thing that somebody needs to explain away in order for you to trust their answer. That's a head smack. Next slide, please. So strategic use of evidence, by contrast, as I said, it's 88% accurate, best reported. It tends to range in the mid to high 70s, even with naive people, meaning people who only have 4 hours of training on this technique. Has two very simple assumptions, and I think you'll agree these are very intelligent assumptions. One, both truth tellers and liars want you to believe them. Duh. Assumption 2, though, is that the strategies undertaken by truth tellers and liars are very different. If I have you take away one thing besides 86.5% of financial information is in text, one other thing today, it's the following. Truth tellers, in response to a line of inquiry and questioning, respond very differently than deceivers. Truth tellers, once they get the hint that you may believe that they're deceiving, that you think they're deceiving you, then they will actually jump out of the context of the line of inquiry and they will lead you to the evidence that will exonerate them, and do so quite aggressively. Deceivers, on the other hand, in response to a similar line of inquiry, will actually steer away. And it's that difference in behavior that you look for with strategic use of evidence. So you ask very broad questions. I'll give you an example in just a minute. And you use what's called a funnel technique to narrow down the context. If you're really good at this, they don't even have to know what evidence you have on them in order to know that they've been deceiving. And then you watch what happens. Next slide, please. Okay, so the funnel technique, I said you start with broad questions. Let's say you're in Trafalgar Square someday in London, and then you're pulled in for questioning by a Bobby, and the Bobbies, the detectives at Scotland Yard, begin interviewing you because there's been a robbery of an ATM in Trafalgar Square. And they might, if they were using the strategic use of evidence technique, say, hey, do you ever have cause to be in London? Well, sure, of course I have cause to be in London. Have you been in Trafalgar Square recently? Well, yes, I have. Notice the narrowing of the context. Do you ever have cause to remove money from the ATM? At that moment, that's a very interesting question. Mind you, could be a witness that saw you break in. It could be a video camera evidence. We haven't revealed the evidence yet. A truth teller may get the hint that there has something to do with the ATM machine. And at that point, if they think that you are questioning them whether or not there was a robbery of some sort, they may say, oh yeah, in fact, here's the receipt I have from there. Or let's go on to my online banking. I'll show you the withdrawal I made at that ATM. A deceiver, on the other hand, say, you know what? I don't know. I misspoke. It wasn't Trafalgar Square. It was actually on the West End. And I was in London recently, but I was on the West End. And that deviation away from the line of inquiry is where you get that 88% accuracy. Super simple technique. It works. I've trained other people how to do it. They report back to me that it works. Next slide, please. So that brings us to deception truth analysis. Next slide, please. So say you have a use and you want to digest a gigantic volume of data and you want to take use or make use of computing power. Well, deception truth analysis allows you to do just that. I did not pioneer this line of inquiry and this line of research. It was actually pioneered by a guy named Dr. James Pennebaker. He's a sociolinguist at the University of Texas here in the US. And what you look at are the fingerprints of language. Technically, they're called psycholinguistic cues, and I'll be giving you a couple of examples of them. And it's how people use the language, not what language is used, that you're looking for. Next slide. So as I said, 86.5% of financial data is contained in text, not numbers. I told you if I wanted you to take away one thing, remember that, because it means you need to have some technique for evaluating that text in ideally a formal way. Texts tend to be underlying of behaviors. I'll give you an example of that in just a second. So if we evaluate the text, we get a hint of the behavior. And when we evaluate the behavior, we can tell all kinds of things, including whether or not somebody's being deceptive. Here's some examples of psycholinguistic cues. Leaders use more third-person pronouns than first-person pronouns. The reason why is because they trust they can speak for the entirety of the group. So Michael, in his remarks, mentioned we, and he used we. I noticed when he was referring to ZN, because he's one of the leaders of ZN, he feels comfortable speaking for the entirety of the organization. Somebody else may not. They may say, I believe, And that first person pronoun usage versus third person pronoun is one of the ways we can identify who is the leader in a group setting. Another one, men use more words per sentence. I'm very verbose. My wife would agree. I use way more words per sentence than she does. Men also tend to use more nouns than do women. Women tend to use more adjectives. And there are, in fact, techniques where you can discern the gender of a speaker based on some of these psycholinguistic cues with very high accuracy. Truth tellers and deceivers also use language differently. I'll give you some in just a moment. Next slide, please. Okay, so what you're looking at here, this is indicative of behavior existing in financial documents. So these are the top 10 biggest scandals in corporate publicly traded history. They total $144.3 billion of loss for shareholders, unfortunately. And when we feed into what we call data algorithm, we are able to discern a scandal that has high levels of deception, on average 6.6 years before these scandals became known to the market. Our theory, it has not been scientifically examined, our theory is that the numbers are what the market is interpreting. And so these scandals were broken by analysts who, like in the case of Enron, grilled Jeff Skilling on a conference call, and it's their diligent work that led to the scandal breaking. It could be auditors revealing a qualified opinion. It could be a regulator who says this document needs greater scrutiny based on whatever means. We'll call that the public announcement date. But we can look at the behaviors as indicated by the language and get a 6.6 year lead time on these scandals. By the way, we were blown away when we first fed these into the algorithm. The algorithm was developed for an entirely different purpose. I can answer why in Q&A if you're interested, but we were shocked that they were getting that kind of lead time. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through this slide in great detail, but it is in the deck for you to evaluate. These are the scandals. These are the deception scores. Negative scores are bad. Positive scores are good, meaning truthful. The red is the year the scandal broke, and there may be no score for those years because in the instance, for example, of Enron, the scandal broke in 2001. They never issued an annual report for 2001 or for 2002. I'll use AIG as an example. You can see the scandal broke in 2005. They did then issue another report in 2006, and then I lost interest in the story, and I did not score 2007, 2008. But that's what that red means, is the year the scandal broke. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll give you some freebies. It pains me to do so, but here are some indicators of fraudulent behavior on the part of companies. And by the way, this first one I have heard, and I believe gut. Mind you, you can measure this scientifically, which is what these scores are from, but I've noticed that sometimes you'll hear a swear word on an earnings call, for example, or in a public presentation from an executive. Turns out that's almost 300% more likely to be indicative of fraudulent behavior than if you don't hear that level of language. Words that reference the body, deceivers use them at a much higher percentage. All these are statistically significant, by the way, much higher percentage than truth tellers. Here's why. This comes from the deception science. Deceivers are referencing an abstraction of reality. They're inventing a story on the fly as to how they got to where they are in this moment in this time, whereas truth tellers are actually referencing a real memory. Their bodies were in a space somewhere in some physical location. And so consequently, we are going to reference our body. So if I said, how did I come to be in front of you today? I would make reference to my body. Well, I walked into my office, I grabbed a cup of coffee, et cetera, et cetera. Deceivers are referencing abstraction, so they use references of the body at a much lower percentage. They also, deceivers, use risk type words much, much higher than normal. So if you hear a lot of risky type words and people, walking the cliff's edge in an earnings call, for example, tends to be more indicative of deception. Liars use more first-person pronouns. This one I did not put in the deck because it's an emerging line of inquiry, one I'm very curious to explore the ramifications of. Not just any first-person pronouns. Some of the emerging research shows that they use me at a much greater percentage than I. So they use more first-person pronouns, but within that, much higher percentage of me. Psychologically, it's because me is somewhat distanced from I. I is a more intimate personal pronoun than is me. Consequently, they're probably trying to create a psychological distance between their statement and their audience. Next slide, please. So I'm going to quote to you research we did on the Dow Jones. We did a very simple piece of research. We have our algorithm. We fed in the annual reports of all of the Dow Jones Industrial Averages components. That's 30 components. We scored them for their level of deception when their annual reports came out. Then we waited, on average, 8.033 months until the first trading day of the next year. Said another way, most people tend to issue their annual reports in the springtime, not in the fiscal year period, which tends to be, all other periods of the year. So on average, we waited 8.033 months. First trading day of the following year, we executed the following very simple trade. Don't buy the 5 worst scoring firms, equal weight the rest. So don't buy the 5 worst, equal weight the 25 best scoring. Repeat this analysis each year. Go ahead and advance the slide. And this is in support of the contention that there's alpha just laying there for you to discover. The average annual return of this strategy is 104 basis points of alpha. These are not optimized results. It's just the same algorithm that we use for everything else. The total return is 11.85% and outperformance in 9 of 11 years. Sharpe ratio, as you can see, is fairly massive. And yes, that includes a risk-free rate, though, and not a negative risk-free rate either, a positive risk-free rate. Next slide, please. Okay, so summarize, and I know this has been a sprint, but I want to, as Michael said, this is really about you guys, not me. In summary, body language doesn't work. Please don't rely on body language. It's been proven over and over again. You may think you're a superstar. The superstars have been tested. They're not. The best tested group of all time, not interrogators, not police detectives, it's teachers. Teachers are 70% accurate at uncovering deception. Psychologists are relatively high in the low 60s, but everybody else stinks. There are no superstars, even the supposedly trained. Liars and truth tellers respond to questioning very differently. Truth tellers will lead you to the evidence that will exonerate them. Deceivers will try and steer you away from the line of inquiry. And computer-driven text-based deception detection is possible. It's a huge time saver. You can evaluate tens of thousands of words per second. So we've been clock speed tested, for example, at 280 text pages per second, and our accuracy is much higher than people. Q&A. And I'm going to switch away. You're going to see me switch away to email. You'll see my eyes wander only because I heard my email going off as I was speaking. So some of you have submitted documents. Go ahead, Michael.
Super. Have you got enough documents for what you need, Jason, or do I need to put another call out?
I have received 3, including one from you, Michael, I believe.
Darn right, I'm curious.
Yeah. So anyway, I will open up the floor to Q&A, and I'll begin scoring these in the background.
Oh, super. Well, the first question is from Dan Peony. So is a famous detective like Sherlock Holmes still unable to discern truth from lies?
Given that it's a fictional character, I would say if he were alive, let's test him. I'm dubious that he would be able to tell. He might be able to tell based on context, which sometimes works. Vocal intonation, by the way, sometimes works. The success of vocal intonation is around 66%. All other stuff basically is not reliable. So I would question the great detective, but if he were alive, I'd say let's test him. Maybe
another one. I mean, this is a bit of kind of, spy, counter spy type stuff from Mad Magazine. How much could sophisticated liars pick up from your analysis to ensure that they in turn appeared more truthful?
Great question. We have tried to control for spoofing, and because we're looking at not specific language. For example, one of the ways that somebody tried to approach this technique were a group of researchers from Columbia University, and what they did is they looked for the 2- and 3-word sequences that, when they occurred in earnings call transcripts, were predictive of future negative earnings performance, stock price performance. They stupidly published those words. Follow-up research done last year by Georgia State University here in the United States found that, guess what? The signal has gone away. Not only that, there were reports anecdotally that executives at some of these firms had received speech coaching from linguists to excise those bad words. So what you want to look at is how the language is used. So going back to the psycholinguistic cues, if you are going to spoof our algorithm, and we're looking at more than 30 psycholinguistic cues, we're not reporting how many we actually look at, but we're looking at more than 30, you would have to change all of your personal pronoun usage, for example, and all the other ones as well. For each score that we do, we typically evaluate what percentage of language we have evaluated. On average, it's between 78 and 82%. People use language differently. That's why there's a range there. Said another way, you'd have to alter 78 to 82% of the language you use in order to spoof it. But I don't put it past people. People are very clever, and when the incentives are large, maybe they'll discover a way to spoof our algorithm, but we think it would be very difficult. Michael, before you ask the next question, the first document that was submitted to me, which was by Dan Feeney, and I never read these things, I just score them, has scored, where did it go? Our scores range between 0 and 100, meaning truthful, so a positive 100, very truthful score, 0 and minus 100, very deceptive. Deception score 94.6%, meaning highly truthful document, don't know what you submitted. And the fraud probability, 8%. And that score ranges between 0 and 100% because it's a probability. All right, next question.
Dan, if you wouldn't mind just typing in a summary of what the document was, I'll read it out to everyone. Actually, Jason, one of the things that I'm interested in is there are certain pet hate words. A lot of people repeat various things, okay, 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 or ahem, ahem, ahem. The one that currently has been getting I've been bugbeared with for about the last 10 years has been literally. So I just want everybody to know that literally is a good sign of a fake document. Maybe I can get rid of this. Anyway, Ian Waddy, along kind of it's interesting where the audience is taking this. Ian is kind of, can people train themselves to write in a more truthful style? So it's not necessarily being fraudulent, but you want your document to be convincing. So, is this a way in which you could run scores and basically come up, I guess, in many ways with better marketing?
Possible. We've tried to control for that in a number of ways because we don't want our algorithm used for that. One of them is price. So our algorithm is priced very expensively. So somebody's going to pay us a small fortune to learn how to do that. And by the way, our double-blind tested scientific accuracy is 87.5% with low false positives as well as false negatives. In other words, they're roughly equal there. And we think that we're measuring the behavior pretty accurately. So here's I'll just give the double-blind test so you can see that you don't really need to change your style. You just need to change whether you're being authentic and honest rather than deceptive. That test that we did was on the WarCard database. It's 935 known truthful statements from the George W. Bush administration, the lead up to the Gulf War, and 935 false statements by the same speakers in the same moment. So imagine at a press conference, a speaker gives a presentation, then responds to reporters' questions. Reporters fact check, so they know the truthful statements. They also know the deceptive statements. Your algorithm has to be able to discern in real time. That's where our accuracy number comes from. And so what we have found is the best thing to do, the best strategy is just tell the truth. And if you're telling the truth, our algorithm should be able to pick up on that as well.
Okay. Just coming back to the first document you scored, Dan says that's 150 authors on a global assured identity network game promoting a global framework for digital identity. So glad to hear there. Dan says he's happy with the high score, which is super. That's great. Yen Kon is curious, have these studies been conducted in markets other than the US for English, but also have these studies been conducted in languages other than English so far?
For the electronic version of what we've done, there have been limited studies that have been done. I have seen a report of the Chinese language. I think I've seen Portuguese, strangely enough. But that is one of the areas of research that we're very keen to explore ourselves. Right now, the only claim that we can make is that it works in English. We have looked at Indian versions of English, UK version, even the crazy Scots, the crazy Irish, because the accents are so different and the way they express is different. We haven't looked at Welsh people speaking English. We have looked at non-native people using English. Oh, and I mentioned the other parts of the Commonwealth, Australia and Canada, we have looked at. Within English, we're fairly confident of our results. We don't know about other languages yet. Great question. And by the way, I have the next document available. I think this was the one that you submitted, Michael, which was Final Tiger Report. This one scores as slightly deceptive, minus 6.9%, fraud probability 37.6%. So I
Oh,
don't know
I
what that is.
cannot believe this. This is worse than I thought. This report is a UK special committee set up to look at the advantages of leaving the EU. It reported 2 years ago. It was led by Oliver Letwin, a very senior person over here, and he was looking at some tens of thousands, about 10,000 regulations, and trying to figure out if we got rid of them, how much would our Brexit bonus be? The team concluded that I think about 36 out of 9 or 10,000 could be eliminated for some extremely marginal gains, and these were Brexiteers. Can you just repeat that score again?
Minus 6.9%, so slightly deceptive. Our score is again 0 to minus 100. For point of contrast in education, Enron scored typically in the minus 60% range. The highest document, the worst document we've ever seen are the prepared remarks made by Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos at a medical industry conference where she was defending the science behind what Theranos did. And that we won't report the score on because that factors into how we score things. But it's the most extreme score we've ever seen. Safe to say it scored minus 100. So minus 6.9% by comparison, not super deceptive, but slightly deceptive.
Well, I'm going to feed this one back for sure to the government. Now, Eric Brutin's dialing in from Toronto, and he'd like to take this just a little bit further. Have you applied D.A.T.A. to analyzing political manifestos and party political statements? I can't believe you haven't.
Indeed, we have. That was one of the first things that we did. We're trying to steer clear, as you might well understand, from political checking of that kind until we're an established business. we don't want to create a firestorm that we then have to defend. We'd rather we tend to think our ideal user is somebody who's making an important decision for which they're otherwise flying blind when evaluating texts, and who would like a second opinion, or they would like the ability to have their attention directed to a particular place to make a decision. But this could be used for personal correspondences, which we have also tested. So for example, letters between people, we've looked at letters in the 19th century to see if we're able to pick up on the levels of deception in known deceptive documents. We've looked at email exchanges, et cetera, et cetera. We've tried to be as thorough as possible to have confidence that our algorithm actually is measuring behavior and is not sensitive to being accurate within a particular domain. I have more reports or more results to report. Somebody submitted Russian foreign policy analysis. Deception score here is 60.1%, so meaning very truthful. That's more truthful than Procter & Gamble, which are the Boy Scouts of the Dow Jones, by the way. Procter & Gamble, their entire history of documents that have been issued are all truthful. This is scoring as more truthful than that.
That's interesting. Well, so the Soviets are, sorry, the Russians are more truthful than the British government. Let's not go there. Let's Dan, again, quickly though. Dan says, given what you just said, any comments on the annual reports from the big techs in the FANG world, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. But I'm also kind of curious in the same sense, almost sectoral duplicity or honesty.
Well, good question. We worked with a very large auditor with global presence who reached out to me earlier this year, who had gotten wind of what we were up to, and they asked us to evaluate the entirety of their auditing universe for, I believe, 4 years. And we were able to score it in about 4 minutes, their whole auditing universe. And they were super impressed that in that whole swath of documents, some of them same issuer, right? So same issuer, but multiple documents. We only uncovered 6 that actually scored as deceptive. So just because, like that Dow Jones result that I reported, when I said we didn't buy the 5 worst, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were scoring as deceptive. In fact, only 2 firms in the Dow are scoring as deceptive. That is JP Morgan is consistently the most deceptive firm in the Dow, slightly so, like minus 15-ish%, but consistently minus 15%. And Apple just last year became negative as well. Prior to that, Apple, was just slightly truthful. Now they're registering as slightly deceptive. I have not looked specifically or drilled down into Facebook's results we've scored the entirety of the S&P 500, but I have not looked at individual companies within there. So I couldn't answer that better.
Well, there's a lovely comment here from Eric Tracy, who's done a tremendous amount of work over decades on trying to improve corporate reporting. Your analysis of the big U.S. corporate scandals reinforces my oft-made recommendation to the government regulators that companies and auditors should be required to address major criticisms of their strategy or performance and explain why they disagree. Applying your analysis, those explanations would be very revealing. And Eric Brutian, again, with a brief comment, Meyer Lansky famously said, don't lie. Tell one lie, then you got to tell another lie to compound on the first. Does D.A.T.A. allow one to differentiate between source lies and derivative lies?
I'm not sure I understand that distinction. Whoever the questioner is, could you mind going off mute or chatting in the distinction there?
I think we're talking about is when you begin with one lie, is there almost a tree of lies? And can your system say, well, actually, if this was true, then all these subsidiary statements would be true, but this may not be true, and that's why they seem duplicitous.
It's a good question. I'm going to answer it slightly different because then I can rely upon data. We have the ability to roll through the entirety of a document rather than scoring the entirety of a document. So I'll give you an example from our research. The We company, alias WeWork, issued an S1, that's an initial IPO document. Their whole document actually scored as very truthful, 56%. But as we rolled through that document, there were six places in that document which had very high levels of deception, greater than the minus 100. And again, we cap it at plus 100, minus 100. And they had to do with things that they actually got in trouble with. So very specifically, the worst score in that document had to do with their relationship to SoftBank, as well as their cash on hand and what they're going to do. My point is that even within that document, there were truthful statements and there were deceptive statements, and we think we're able to discriminate between those two types.
I think it's an excellent, actually, I think that's exactly what Eric was about. Bob McDowell here.
Oh, I have one more result to report, sorry. Channel Islands Patois has scored 56.1%, so kind of Procter & Gamble-ish. So not especially high levels of deception. In fact, high levels of truth.
Bob McDowell here. Do short sentences strengthen the accuracy? Well, sorry, the score. And do Latin words suggest deception?
Latin words I have not looked at. Short words, no.
Short sentences, sorry.
Short sentences. It's actually rather the reverse. You get a freebie because I'm feeling generous. One of the language fingerprints that we look at is the complexity of language. One of the proxies for that is the average syllables per word. And the higher the syllable count, typically the more deceptive. So smaller words tend to score as more truthful. Freebie.
Okay. Now, Olivia Bosch is curious, and I think this goes back to your opening. Does anxiousness or guilt have different cues than feeling intimidated by a tough questioner?
This is exactly, great question. This is exactly why body language is not reliable. It's not that we can't read whether somebody is anxious. It's that there are no body language cues that are uniquely associated, or combination of body language cues uniquely associated with deception. So if, for example, you're in a job interview, you may be extremely truthful in your response, but you may also be very anxious. So somebody trained in the fine art of body language, and actually we'll say the fine magic of body language because it doesn't work, it's wishful thinking that it works, would be misreading whether or not you're truthful, because what they're really picking up is on your level of anxiety. So great question. And that's exactly the other big reason why body language fails, besides the fact that there are not unique cues, is there are several unique cues, but those cues are so weak as to be imperceptible even by computers. And there are only two cues that are somewhat noticed by the experts, and they're inconsistent. And by inconsistent, the accuracy is like 53%, 54%. So tough to rely upon those. They all have to do with the level of anxiety, because that's what that theory believes or rests upon, is your response to my line of inquiry is you get anxious, and I look for your anxiousness, and because I'm reading your anxiety to the line of questioning, I therefore read that you're being deceptive, when in fact there are lots of good reasons for somebody to be anxious in a line of inquiry. And then those cues that are reliable are very, very hard to detect. Sorry.
Right.
Too long-winded an answer. My apologies. I'm trying to.
No, it's okay. We got a few more here. Ian Waddy, have you tried speech to text to assess people in real time?
Yes, we've looked at earnings call transcripts, and we get a signal there. Trying to remember what the level of alpha is. Interestingly enough, what we found, what I can report it from memory, is we actually found stronger alpha from the annual reports. Those are the results I've reported for the Dow, which shocked us because most of the academic literature has looked at earnings call transcripts. And typically academics like earnings call transcripts because they like to very reliably say that there's a causal connection between what is said on the earnings call and the stock price performance. And they think that the signal fades because it's been priced in by the markets. Most of the research goes as late as 72 hours, but they have not looked many months out to my knowledge. When we look many months out, we actually get a stronger alpha signal. When we looked at the earnings call transcript, the level of alpha was lower than looking at the annual reports, which surprised us.
Okay. IS is curious if you scored any of the GME AMC discussion, the GameStop, AMC, the meme stocks.
I have not. We've looked at some of that stuff. So for example, not the We company, there's a German-based company that began with a W. It's actually
Wirecard. Yeah.
Yes, Wirecard. We looked at Wirecard, and that was an especially interesting case to us because they began issuing PowerPoint presentations in PDF form to their shareholders. Prior to that, they had no audited reports. And from the first one that they revealed, we showed high levels of deception that only got worse as the year went on. They issued for the second, third, and fourth quarters of, I believe, 2019, 2018. I don't remember when they issued those. And we now know, due to the diligence of an FT reporter, that their auditor in the fourth quarter cried foul internally and said, your internal controls are so poor that you're likely susceptible to fraud. And we were, again, prior to the auditor crying foul internally, we were able to see high levels of deception. So we've looked at Wirecard. We have not looked at that specific use case that you requested. Sorry.
Hugh Purser is going down an interesting line. He's talking about, plagiarism as a form of deception. So if I was to try and, look honest, I would grab a whole bunch of good stuff, so to speak, and then bring in many quotes. So it may be also truthful if it copies something that was originally truthful. So in other words, burying my lies in a whole bunch of truth. Is that possible?
Yeah, in fact, plagiarism would be a poor use case for evaluation for what we do, specifically for that reason, because plagiarism is in itself a single act, and we're looking at the behaviors revealed by language. So if somebody has plagiarized truthful statements, then we're going to be evaluating truth because we're using the language to point at the behavior rather than the reverse, if that makes sense. Okay. Plagiarism is a top-down crime rather than a bottom-up crime.
Well, here's another top-down one. This is from Martin White. I've got a senior responsible manager, and I'm just a minion. How do you manage reports that are written by minions rather than the senior responsible manager?
That's a pretty easy thing to tell. You may be familiar with some of the research that has looked at the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, the Christian Bible, and researchers using psycholinguistic cues are able to note that there are probably multiple composers. I think of the Gospel of Mark, for example. We can control for that, and we do look at that kind of material. It's not especially interesting. What we found is that culturally, it doesn't matter who writes the document, there tends to be levels of deception within an organization, and they're using, here's a simpler way to understand it. The strategies that people use to cover up bad behavior tend to transcend speaker. So in other words, if there's a lie, let's just hypothetically imagine there's a lie to hide or something that we're uncomfortable, may not be a lie, could be Apple tries to talk down a quarterly performance from being super robust and wonderful to a more modest level because they're trying to manage their earnings. There's something they're trying to cover up. The strategies for covering up are what we're looking at. So it doesn't matter really who authored that document. It's whether or not are they engaged in a behavior where they're trying to cover up. And so we think we're probably sensitive to that, but we haven't looked at every document, so you never know.
Well, sadly, we're running out of time, so quick ones. Hugh Purser sadly dropped this in quite late. Any interesting examples of crypto offering documents? I might like to talk to you about that. We did a study on crypto showing that over 62% of them were fraudulent to begin with, but and a similar study at Boston College, but we didn't use the offering documents. Steve Cohen encourages you, when will the Justice Department use this in trials? I guess that would be the ideal for you. But I'm going to give you 30 seconds, I shouldn't, but from Paul Rossi. How do we learn more, get more training? In other words, how do we buy from you? But very quickly.
Yeah. Well, last thing, CSIQ document submitted, the worst one submitted, minus 34.7%, high probability of fraud, 50% likelihood of fraud. I don't know what that document is. You can go to our website, deceptionandtruthanalysis.com. You can also email me directly, jvoss@deceptionandtruthanalysis.com. Happy to talk to you about any of the technologies. They're more than the two I reported here today. There are multiple techniques that do work. D.A.T.A is, of course, the one I represent, and we'd love to show you what we can do.
Okay, thank you. And folks, while I'm just closing up here, please just hit into the question box if you want to be put directly in touch with Jason. Jason, thank you. But just before I close, I've got a couple rounds of thanks. My first round of thanks is, as ever, to our sponsors. And trust me, that is very truthful because they allow us to do all of this stuff, which is amazing. They really are generous people. Secondly, if I may, thank you to the audience. You've been particularly engaged, and I certainly am interested in be contacting Jason. We've got a lot of things coming up later this week. This is how they tell me the world ends. I'm not quite sure cyber weapons are that bad, but I'm told that this could be pretty Armageddon-ish. We've got the launch of the Global Financial Centers Index 30 this Friday, and a fascinating bit on modern monetary theory, something we've always been going into. And despite the vicious attacks on it, the truth behind what I might call the less public modern monetary theory has actually got a lot going for it. So there's a lot coming up. As ever, just check out the website. But Jason, you've led us through a great canter through a deep area where you've put a lot of hard work in. And I absolutely adore your live demo, which certainly convinced me when you took apart a document I found people defending and went, no, Michael, it's really not stacking up. This has been super. We hope that we can explore some of your other techniques in future sessions. But may I thank you so much for dialing in today from Florida.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the FS Club. You guys were all great.